The power of positive thinking impresses upon your mind the immediate desire to click the subscribe button. Now. So let's go ahead today and discuss the matter of suffering. I don't want to call it the problem of suffering, right? Because that makes a certain assumption. If I call it problem, then somebody's gonna start on the defensive or start from that position that suffering fundamentally is a problem. But you and I have a different perspective on suffering. Has your view of suffering changed? I mean, have you suffered in life and seen it as something of a negative force, and then revise that position?
I think, of course, I think everybody sees it as a negative force initially, and as your gut response, and everybody continues to see it. I mean, it's not too common to see people volunteer for suffering, although it does happen. You see it in monastics, you see it in, various, I sometimes have chosen to suffer just to kind of test myself and see what I'm about. I had a few years ago, I had a molar removed without lidocaine.
That a guy, there you go. I wrote a piece not too long ago, and I cite my uncle who absolutely refused any sort of dental numbing agents, and just goes all natural. So
yeah, I mean, I just tried it once to see what it was, to see if I could do it. But yeah, I think we all naturally have a gut response against it. I mean, of course, it's not something that we enjoy. It's kind of the opposite of pleasure. So, of course we would have that.
Yeah, for most people, it's not. I mean, sure, there are folks who are into it, but most of us might put it in the unappealing or displeasurable category, something like that. But do other things fit in those categories in life, right? The unappealing, the unfavorable, the displeasing, the whatever doesn't feel pleasant. Here I go again, the same word. But I think there's other, like homework, right? Homework can fit in that category too. Maybe we could call it a type of suffering in certain when you're a kid, right? Like you're doing things, you're doing activities in your own development that fit in those boxes, but there's a different awareness, and we may not call that suffering. Maybe we call it, it's annoying, or it's boring, or it's whatever it is. They're tasks that we do to craft ourselves. And so I wonder then if we can talk about suffering more broadly, in light of those other displeasures.
When I hear people, and very often, I'm in a Coptic world full of very successful people, who you take those basic principles of orthodoxy and you apply them into America, and you tend to have a pretty good life,
Yeah.
And I hear them when they talk about the poor, and I hear others, talking about the poor. And I kind of crack up, because I grew up poor on welfare. The world I lived in was poor. I ran a shop for many years, and everybody I hired was poor from that world. And there is this, for me, the single most standout trait that fosters that world and continues it is the question of delayed gratification and immediate gratification. So we're back to what you're talking about. I can have pleasure at this moment, or I can say no to the pleasure and put myself through some level of suffering at this point. So like you're saying, even homework, and I used to say that, hey, this dorky kid who was home doing his homework while I was out smoking weed and, sleeping around with girls. Well, now he's got a nice home with a, big income, and I'm laying on 145-degree asphalt on my back under a motorhome, turning a wrench. And there's a reason for that, that I chose the immediate gratification. And you have it modeled in your home, in your community, in your school, it's modeled everywhere. And this is the paradigm. Go open a poor person's fridge. You'll find plenty of beer, and they have some really expensive weed they're smoking. And, it's all about, this moment of relief. And I have sympathy for it, because there is a relief that you want from this world that you're living in. So I understand it, but it doesn't change the dynamic that if you don't choose the suffering, the harder road, the delayed gratification, there are going to be longer term ramifications that are going to be ultimately more painful. And that's kind of, our Christian faith very much teaches that. These were things that I was kind of discovering before I even became Orthodox, before I really entered into a place where voluntary self-imposed suffering of fasting, of standing through long liturgies, of, disciplines that you put on yourself. Before I'd even encountered those, I had kind of caught the concepts, and I had learned that, if you wanted to ask me what are the most great and profound things that ever happened to me in my life, I would probably point you to the worst. I would point you to the time when I was looking across the room at a shotgun and coming up with a plan how to get out the window and down the street so my family didn't have to deal with the mess, and times when I was in utter torment, going through my divorce. And, I would, losing 2 weeks after walking into a Coptic church, I lost my job of 28 years. And I also lived there. So it was my home, and it was under pretty dirty circumstances. And, you talk about devastation, and I'm in my 40s. But looking back, that is one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. So I think that, hopefully we gain some perspective, especially as we get a little older, that the suffering can help to form things in us. And if you don't volunteer, you're going to go through some suffering, right? And, there's that saying that the same sun that hardens the clay melts the wax. Mm-hmm. That, it doesn't, suffering, I don't like saying suffering produces X, Y, or Z, because it doesn't necessarily. And some people, it just makes you worse, but it can produce that if it's received, understood, and handled in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was curious to hear your opinion on when you mentioned the voluntary aspect of suffering, and that seems to indicate to me, first, before one makes it voluntary or not, right? There's got to be an awareness, and what is the default sort of position on something like suffering? Because I think you just said it. You can repeat or rephrase, but there's a time where things may not be voluntary, but what might be voluntary is related to our awareness, right? The perception of the event
and our response to it.
Yes, right. So, what does it take, for folks who are on the other side and they accept a paradigm where suffering bad, eliminate all suffering, that's the goal. If someone is from that starting position, what's the transition? How does one develop?
I think one might point back to when they themselves or others that they respect have seen suffering produce something great. If you look back through history, right, you got pretty much all the heroes were born out of suffering, and horrible circumstances that we wouldn't choose, nobody would choose those, but it formed them into what they are. They might be somebody who has a great deal of respect for like U.S. Marines.
Mm-hmm.
And then you point back to, explaining what actually they go through in boot camp and the suffering that gets imposed upon them to form this in them. One thing that I noticed when I'd become Orthodox, we understand salvation, soteriology, in these terms where, Christ becomes human and joins himself to humanity. And taking it into himself, he changes what it is to be human. And I noted that in the Old Testament, when you see suffering, it's always in a negative light, always, and it's like, it's usually because they really screwed up. They turned their back on God, and God either directly or indirectly puts them into, or allows them into a position and a period of great suffering. And this is throughout the whole Old Testament. It's not a good thing.
Right.
But then you look at the New Testament, and everywhere you see suffering mentioned, it's in a positive light. It's said in a good way. And it's like, wait, what happened to suffering that it went from being bad to something that actually is used for good? Christ joined suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It got joined to him in his divinity, and it transfigured what suffering is and what it will do if you find yourself in Christ. So I think for those people, I would say, though these principles work generally, but I would just point to, the instances, the times, the places where they know the suffering did do a good thing, where it does do a good thing, where the studying for finals and then the degree and the long-term benefit after going through the suffering. So I think that would be the best intro. I mean, Sam Harris, I think it was, that I heard talk about, what he calls objective morality, which is ridiculous because he can't ground it at the bottom. If you can't ground it at the bottom, it's not objective. And it starts with a presumption of the value of human life and human benefit, what we would call human benefit. Well, you have to ground that first. You don't get to use that as your starting place. You have to say, why? Why is human benefit? That's just preference. That's not morality. But in any event, he kind of defines it as that which does the most good for the most people or alleviates the most suffering from the most people. But really, I mean, think about it. If you raised a child and kept him away from all obstacle, all resistance, all pressure, all form of suffering, what kind of a person would you end up with?
Right.
I
think the word resistance is kind of key too, right? Especially like take weight training or something where the word resistance, it is actively used in order to build. You must endure resistance and you must endure obstacle in order to, break down muscle fiber so it rebuilds at a larger mass, right?
Well, there's a great point. So beyond the resistance, what's the second feature? Is nutrients. So you have to have them, because of the resistance without the nutrients, you're not building nothing, you're just going to get sicker and weaker and die. And the nutrients without the resistance, you're going to get obese and weak and atrophy.
Yeah.
But you put both of those together. And so I think that's a really important point to bring up, that if we want to talk about suffering, we have to talk about, and how it can be beneficial. We have to talk about, what are you putting in to you as you're encountering and facing this resistance and pushing back against it and growing through it? What kind of nutrients are you putting in? And, let's go back to your weight training. You got somebody standing over you and saying, this doesn't matter. You're going to go through all this for nothing because the game is rigged and you won't gain muscle. You won't gain fitness. You won't gain strength. Pretty quick, you're going to put those weights down and you're going to stop. So, here we go again with kind of the broader picture of things and versus you got a coach up there. And what is that coach telling you? You can do it, keep pushing, come on. And I'll help you a little, but you got to do the pushing. And so you got two different kinds of coaches there. And I think we can look at our society and see both of those voices pretty clearly.
It makes sense. The suffering event, right, is, we'll call it the resistance, or at least it has some type of resistive element to it. And so it's not about just, is it only about pushing back, or is it about, what you're taking in as you're pushing back, and not to think of it as one suffering event, but rather however, sorry, I use them all together, and I know you're not supposed to, but I can make my own rules. It's my show. So, rather than think of it as one event, it's more processual, right? And if you're feeding the right way, I guess I'm repeating what you're saying. You're putting the right things into your body. You're positioning your body to respond to the suffering event with repair mechanism, right? And so that repair mechanism isn't just fixing what happened, but it's actually improving and preparing, the next suffering event at being in a better position for it. And so when I think about it, then I'm thinking there's a sliding scale to this, and, trying to make, a whole, worldview on elimination of suffering is kind of lame. And, I teach my classes, and especially those that deal with suffering. I quote Mel Brooks quite frequently, who said, when I see a man step into a manhole and die, that's comedy. When I stub my toe, it's tragedy. Right. And so that's, it's intended to be funny and make you laugh. It made me laugh the first time I heard it. And I love the phrase, because I see Mel's face, as he's stubbing his toe. Like, now the world is over. I've stubbed my toe, but the guy dying, who's going to fall into a manhole and die? That's obnoxious. That's ridiculous. So there's a degree of, like, obviously it's a joke, but, stubbing your toe, you see different people react in different ways to, these event stimuli. And, like, the premise that, removing suffering is the necessary need for advancing humanity is lost just on the sliding scale, if I think about it.
Well, I hate to tie everything back to orthodoxy, but honestly, that's my
it's
world.
Okay, you're Orthodox, you can
do
whatever you want.
And coming from my evangelical background, I was at a mega church for quite a while, and the head pastor, he's like the shepherd who comes down from the hill, his mansion on the hill, once a week, and collects up the fleece and gives you a little pep talk and goes back up the hill. But he never gets dirty, he never gets fleas on it, and even the sub shepherds, in Orthodoxy, when we talk about the nutrients, that we put into us, it's just been amazing to me to have a priest, and that's what he does basically. Is you're going through the resistance and the suffering, he meets with you periodically and frequently to he gives you nutrition, spiritual, mental, psychological nutrition, to be able to address and deal with this suffering in a way that it produces strength and muscle, instead of just something that, is, and he also tailors to make sure that you have kind of the right resistance on the resistance you're choosing to undergo. So you're not, struggling under a barbell across your throat that you can't move, and you're not pushing an empty bar, but he keeps you in a place where you have the right resistance and the right input and the right nutrition to be able to allow this suffering and this difficulty to help you to grow and to strengthen your soul.
Yeah. I mean, there's an input, right? And so, in that case, like, the awareness is there already, I think, and the perspective on suffering is going to be different than, Western society at large these days. But, a lot of listeners aren't from that perspective. And I wonder if it's a good starting point just to be conscious of the inputs that prep unfortunate, unpleasant, whatever events, things that we would lump into suffering, to get to at least reformat the way we look at it and say, it's not the problem of suffering. I mean, if we call it the problem of suffering, that, we've stated our position. If it's the matter of suffering in the human condition, and what does that mean? I mean, without suffering, we don't get the types of art, that humanity has produced. There's so many benefits that emerge from it, and it's not to say that we should all go suffer. Let's go suffer and get fired up about it, right? Like, let me put a hammer through my toe, or slam my my big toe with a hammer and see how that feels, just for fun, and that's not it. That, like, it's just maybe being dispassionate, I guess.
It's funny that you mentioned art, because I've mentioned that to my wife so many times. There were, the great icons from the golden era of rock and roll and stuff, and I came into it, years later, because I'm always, 10 years behind any curve. But like when I, discovered Guns N' Roses, and it had been, 10 years after they had, come out with stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's amazing, and his writing and everything. And then I found out about, this guy was a mental wreck, the angst that he was under and the torment he was under. And then I understood, like, he finally got some psychological help after beating up a pizza delivery guy or something. And it was like, that was it. He couldn't write anymore, But there is something in the angst and the anguish and the suffering that does kind of bring something out from some people, and it does, there's, I think when we talk about the perceptions, there's also, so we're talking here about preparation of what we should expect, but there's, this being taken aback, like this shouldn't be happening, and this isn't normal. There's something weird is happening when we go through a suffering. And I very often hear, people saying, like, oh, you don't know what it's like to be a Black man in America. And I don't, obviously, but I wonder, I really believe that he doesn't know what it's like to be a white man. And so we might have an idea in our mind that something else is much easier than it is. And so therefore the suffering, whatever it is I go through, might be elevated in my mind, not realizing, the basic premise that life is hard as hell for everybody.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, if you're, a Black kid in an all white school, or a white kid in an all Black school, and you're going through, torment and suffering from the other kids who are jerks. How about the kid with big ears? How about the ginger kid? Go talk to a ginger kid sometime about what they went through when they went to school. That we just, because we don't know how much suffering others go through. I honestly am of the belief, and I have been for most of my life, that by the time you're 8 or 10 years old at the latest, you've been through the full spectrum of human emotion and experience as far as how things hit you. That, the first time a 2-year-old can't have what they want, that's the only time in their life they've ever not gotten what they want.
Yeah.
And that torment is just as real, as the father losing his home and family. I mean, it's huge. So I think, it's a good place to start with understanding the commonality of this suffering between us, and not to have the misperception that others have it great and don't go through suffering, and we do. There are a lot of rich people committing suicide.
Oh yeah.
And we tell ourselves, if only. Well, no, it's not that simple. The human experience, we have a picture in our mind of how much better something is somewhere else, and I think it's a wrong picture.
Yeah, that's a good example. And I think it goes back to, what you were saying at the beginning, just about income and people who've, they've acquired different things. And so what, you and I might be more calloused toward may be a big shift for them when they experience it. And I remember, it's not just in undergrad, but in LA, right? Like there's people who view movies differently. And I've found that the wealthier the person, the more they like, neorealism and, European movements about how terrible and miserable life is. And it's their vicarious experience of that suffering that, oh yeah, that's what we do. It's not an interesting movie for people who already are poor. Like, yeah, well, that's my life for the last 3 years, and like next, and so there's some kind of measurability toward it, whether it's the 2-year-old who hasn't gone through any of that experience. Now this is this, new shock reality happening, or it's the, the far end where it's that level of shock needs to be that great of a loss in order to re-experience something so hard and miserable as that. I think the way in which that there isn't a common basis for suffering other than the subjective unpleasantness. I don't know. I mean, is there a different way you've thought about that?
Well, it's all relative to the world we're living in.
Yeah.
I wrote a book that's going to be coming out soon about, and it starts with my whole background and story. And ultimately the point is about becoming Orthodox and the things I found in Orthodoxy and how they differ from Western religion. But like, here's a great example. So I talk in the book about my first driving lesson. And I grew up in El Monte, in a really crappy little town on welfare with a junkie alcoholic for a dad. And he took me to this little trailer park. And we had this big Ford LTD 4-door, this huge, it was a land yacht, And I think I was probably about 14. And he said, wait here, and he went into this trailer, into this mobile home. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, he came out wasted. He just shot up a bunch of heroin. And he came out to the car and goes, you got to drive, son. And so I scooted over into the driver's seat and I was terrified. I'd never driven before and I got to drive us home with this huge yacht. I look back on that memory with fondness. I remember the smile on his face and the peace. And I remember the excitement that I get to drive a car. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So, I mean, my point here is that you have to understand something in somebody else's perspective that, you might hear that, or somebody that didn't come from a dysfunctional home would hear that and be terrified, but that's not how it was experienced, whereas there can be, some rich kid who's totally, indulged all the time, who's told no finally, and the suffering he goes through. So it's all so complex and relative to your experience.
Yeah, it is. And I think, in a similar vein, that one aspect of suffering that is quite prominent today, that idea of being offended, I think, we don't think of being offended so much, as a suffering event, but I think ultimately it boils down to that. Like the person who is being offended is declaring a state of distress, right? And those who offend, intentionally or unintentionally, they create situations in and among people who, they may or may not know that they're creating distress. I always thought that the idea of being offended was a little tacky. And I remember back in undergrad, I was on a roll. I finally figured out how to be a good writer. And I had 12 essays due over the course of one semester across my classes. And I got 11 out of 12 A's, just because now I get it. Now I've become an effective writer, and the one A that wasn't, I got a C. And it's because the subject matter was deeply offensive to the TA. And those were the comments effectively I got back and read on my, paper that I turned in. And, I'm thinking the whole time, yeah, but like, it's the subject matter, like, what's your issue with me and like the output of the text that's been produced? What's happening to you? And how does that impact, me as a writer? So, I don't know. I think offense it's an issue we should, like suffering, not just take for granted, right? Like, why do we get offended? Why does distress happen? Why does, a suffering event occur in the human person if X, Y, or Z is said? Like the easiest is calling someone a name, or saying something someone doesn't like. Maybe, I mean, and now I'm thinking as I go off on this riff that there are things that may be more commonly offensive than others, right? Like there's things that, we could survey a crowd and maybe only 4 or 5 out of 100 people are offended by it, but they're deeply offended. Maybe it's 10-20%. And then there's like 90-95%. I remember in Japan, we were there at a buddy of ours had, seen this on the Tokyo subway, seeing this guy. He's a homeless guy, a Japanese guy, and in Japan, homeless people are sort of non-people. They get their passports taken away and, kind of shunned from society. He gets on the subway. I could have been a train, but the same difference. And, he just starts wanking it in front of everybody, right? Your eyes just, you react to that, right? There's, maybe it's not distress or offense. Maybe it's like, hey, good on you, bro. But, here he is. And I mean, if Japanese culture among, Asian cultures, but Japanese especially, they're very, very quiet. Don't draw any attention toward it. It will all be over soon. It would just wait to get off. So our buddy goes up, grabs the guy and throws him out of the train. And then everybody, like all the Japanese people, start clapping and, they're very happy. And
wow.
All that distress that was bottled up, right, was relieved because the gaijin comes over and takes care of what would have been socially unacceptable for them to even address. So,
wow. Wow. Wow, that's an experience.
It's we got stories. We all got stories.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also subjective that, what is more generally offensive and less so. But honestly, I think you'd be hard pressed to find reasonable people who will tell us the pendulum hasn't swung too far the other way. And that's, that's humanity, man. I swear there is no progress. There has never been progress in humanity, in the state of humanity. It's every time it's the same thing. We're way off in this direction. We need to correct it. And we swing it way too far the other way. And we lose the good stuff that we had while we were over here. People don't understand what conservatism is, because I was watching, it was Candace Owens talking to somebody, and he says, name me a time that was better, like this golden age, whatever time you want to go back to. Name me the time that was better, that you seem to be reminiscing and missing. And I think he's right in asking that, but I think the whole thing is based on this wrong way we approach it, because at any point you'll find, okay, there are these things that aren't good and need to be addressed, but in doing so, we end up throwing out everything and losing some really important stuff that was good, and that's what I want to conserve the good stuff. And it doesn't mean I'm opposed to change, and certainly there are things that need to be addressed. And absolutely. But I think that's just like this story of human endeavor that, like, okay, we see that, there are things that are tolerated that should offend us, the way that somebody might treat, a person of color or a homosexual or, whatever that. Yes. And the way they might degrade and denigrate them. yes, I get it, and you're right. But it's like this pendulum has swung so far over the other way that there was a couple of guys that they wrote that book, right, on victim culture. I don't know if you're aware of it. I haven't read it, but I kind of read a synopsis, which was really good. And it talked about the three kinds of cultures. So there's honor culture, like in the East and the Middle East, where it's what your neighbors and others around you think of you that is paramount, your reputation in the community. And then there is dignity culture, which is more our Western, where it's what I know of myself. I mean, think back to all the great heroes in all the movies. He's the guy who stood alone and didn't care that everybody else thought the wrong thing of him, because he knew in his heart, and he had the conviction in himself, what he was doing was right. And then he would prevail at the end. And then others would see that he was right. And he would be vindicated. So here you have, the dignity culture, where it's what you know of yourself. And now this third culture that has never been known before, victim culture. And they speak in this book about the new, everything has a victim hierarchy, everything. And they were saying, even in the intellectual arena, the most intelligent and intellectual is the one that can spot offense in the most places. So we hear things like microaggression, and it's like, that if you can see it where other people can't, you're intellectually above those around you who can't see it. And I think that's huge. Like what's going on, and what are we becoming, that this is what we're looking for? I talked to a guy a while back, and he was saying, do you really think that these people are all making it up as far as, being discriminated against or treated differently because of, race or whatever other issue? And I said, no, I don't believe they're making it up. But if you're fed on a narrative, and if you're fed on the narrative of offense, you will see it where it doesn't exist. Not might, you will. Not to say it doesn't exist, but you'll see it in places where it's not there. You'll walk into a store and the clerk behind the counter just had a fight with his wife.
Yeah.
And he's in a really bad mood. And you'll walk out saying, that guy was crappy to me because he's a racist and because of the color of my skin. You'll see it where it isn't. And really, what kind of culture is this going to be? And it is already becoming that. I live in LA, so everybody's pissed off at everybody.
Yeah.
All the time. All the time. Everybody's pissed off. You're in my way. You're offending me here. All the time. Like, what kind of world is that, where we don't have any generosity, any benefit of the doubt that maybe it's not what I think. Maybe this person isn't against me.
Yeah. Yeah. And since you brought up orthodoxy, I'm thinking of, something I read from Maximus the Confessor, regarding, he was sending, letters to the monks. And one of the things he talks about is, in trying to attain love, right? Like perfect love, which that's the broader thing going on. He says, if you're offended by anything, either intentional or unintentional, you don't know the way of peace. Like there's something about you that, is leading toward those distress moments, the inner suffering, and taking you away from, whatever the goal of the monks were. And I think, in light of our conversation, that may apply toward how we conceive of suffering more broadly. But then I asked the question, well, what is worth being offended by? Like here he's saying anything, right? But I understand the goal in mind, that he's saying that is to attain, a perfection in love, and how that person perceives the world. But like there are different things that are that we commonly, and maybe that's the issue, and maybe that's the difference between being a enlightened being, versus being a regular person, right? Like,
I think we have to draw a line between being offended and our response to the thing that offends us. I think those are two very different things, because, very often you can't control your visceral reaction to something. That's, it hits you the way it hits you. And if you're trained one way, you might learn to desensitize and through practice and time, become less sensitive to things. But then there comes a question of my response. How am I going to act when I get offended? And so my question would, my wife is really good at teaching me, you start with, what are you trying to do? What's your goal?
Yeah.
So start there. Okay, I got offended and I'm going to respond. What's my goal in this response? Am I going to try to change this person who might be a jerk? Let's say it's legitimate. This person is a jerk. Am I going to try to change that person? Is that my goal? Like, what kind of a life am I going to have if my goal is to change the jerks in this world into nice people?
Yeah.
How's that going to play out?
More like me.
So you have to ask, what is it? And that's where I think a good, healthy attitude of, learning boundaries. Like, okay, this person is a jerk and I don't have to have interaction with them. So I can, get some space here.
Going back into responding, we talked about that with suffering and the nutrients we take in, right? And so the offensive situations then seem to me similar, because we may be offended to the degree that we're not prepared. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it.
I think a little compassion for the other person probably will go a long way. I hated my mom for most of my life. And then the last few years, I matured and I looked at her background. She grew up in World War II Germany with bombs falling on her, and an abusive mother. And I looked at her formation and I came to understand that she actually did pretty good with the cards she was dealt. She really tried hard, and the things that bothered me, she was trying, and after that, we ended up having the most wonderful relationship. I thank God that she didn't die with things the way they were. We had, for the last couple of years, the most wonderful time. And, I'm in a Coptic church full of Egyptians. Now, yeah, you roll up a tattooed biker, rolling up on a Harley, wearing a t-shirt to liturgy at the Coptic church, there are going to be people who look at you a certain way. People who are, going to gossip about you and, look at you askance. But you see, I think having some compassion the other way, saying, okay, but they're a minority here in America, or, their background, it's the other, the outsider isn't safe, and they've been taught to fear the outsider with good reason, and let's face it, it's never without any reason. There's some reason. So understanding why they're offended, but see, when I stop and I go, okay, but what are they doing to me? An old lady's looking at me like, oh, okay, and that's it. This is my extent of suffering, that she thinks this of me, that she talks to the other woman about me. How is this impacting my life? And the fact is, it really isn't. It doesn't have much impact. So having some compassion for her background and some understanding of how she got there and the basis for her having that kind of fear, and that's usually what it's rooted in, that kind of fear that makes her behave a certain way towards me, I think it's gone a long way for me to be able to walk into any parish and I don't get bothered at all by anybody thinking. And what's funny is, if you don't get offended over time, you may find you have more impact than you think. It was a couple of years in, and I don't know if it was because these old Coptic people heard stories from their grandkids about me teaching classes about how amazing this Coptic church was. I don't know if it was from seeing me at midweek Lenten liturgies that are in Arabic, and I'm standing there with another language and going to multiple liturgies, and they see me all year round. But at some point, they turned a corner. And, there's these old stone-faced Egyptian women. They don't even smile at each other. They don't smile at their husbands. They don't smile at anybody. Right. They started smiling at me. And I didn't expect it. I wasn't looking for it. I'm not there for a social club. I'm there to grow spiritually. Yeah. And I was just like surprised by it. But I think if you don't get offended and you understand there's a reason for look, if I walk into somewhere and I'm a tattooed biker and I'm wearing my scarf and my sunglasses and I look like I just got off my bike and my beard's, and somebody, who is this guy? Yeah, that doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a reason. And there are a lot of guys that look like me that have done a lot of things that ain't too pleasant. And that doesn't come out of thin air. But I can either get offended. How are you judging me because I look this way? Or I can say, yeah, a lot of people look like me. They've done a lot of crappy stuff in the past. I understand it and no problem. And I'll just, over time, I'll show you that that's not me. And then I'm the one who helps you to pick something up when you drop it. And I'm the one that tips you very well. Or I'm the one that is gracious and kind towards you. And I'm starting to actually impact and change their stereotypical thinking. But, I'm actually going to then start having an impact on somebody else in a way that if I were to get all mad and fold my arms or, be aggressive, I would just keep heightening and worsening and affirming what they thought about the kind of person I was. So I think maybe it's good to start by asking, how much is this really affecting me? How much is this really damaging my life that this person's looking at me a certain way, or this person makes a comment a certain way?
Yeah. And going back to Maximus, he looks at being offended as, rooted in self-indulgence and self-esteem, right? And it seems what you described just there was a case study when you don't make it about you, but you take a moment and ask, okay, well, why is the person offended by my presence? Because it's going both ways in this case, right? The immediate reaction is like, well, why would someone at a church treat you that way? That's the self-indulgent, oh, how dare they? But putting them in your mind first, it's a good exercise. And I think that was I
think it's a good question. Why would they treat me that way? But ask it honestly.
Yeah, right.
Not like, why would they, but like for real, like, oh, they have a background and the only people they've seen that look like me are probably on movies, Yeah,
realistically, yeah.
And those, I'm sorry, I know this will offend a lot of people, but the stereotypes come from something.
Yeah.
They come from a reality, all the stereotypes, and it's not to say that now, therefore, everybody who looks a certain way or acts a certain way is the same, but it's to say that, yes, there are generalizations that are true. And so, instead of, and then you can ask yourself, okay, why did they treat me this way? Well, this is why, because they have this perception. Is that perception true or isn't it? It's the next question you should ask yourself, because it might be true. But if it's not true, then it's like, okay, they're mistaken based on an understandable preconception. So now how am I going to respond?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm thinking, tying it all back to our common thread, if I can synthesize, and I'd like to hear what, you have to say about that just to wrap up. But it seems to me that that suffering itself, number one, like we started from the position that it's not a problem. It's not the problem of suffering. It's the matter of suffering.
Not always a problem.
Not always a problem, right? But as a matter, it can be problematic, but it needn't be. And that being the case, it may not be helpful to categorize it as such, but to think of it as event interactions, where it's a resistance event that is conditioned by response to resistance. And, we should ask ourselves both sides of the question: what are we doing to build our response, to those events providing resistance? And is it really something to cause damage or distress?
I don't know. For me, it's like, you've ever been punched in the head,
mm-hmm.
if you've ever been robbed, and you have some kind of perspective on what somebody doing something to damage you is, that I don't know. I think it's helpful, to not be like, oh, this hurt my feelings, and this, like, really, what happened? Like, that's it? Like, it hurt your feelings that somebody said or looked at you a certain way. If that's, do we want fragility? Is this a goal? When I grew up, I like to think of myself very much as traditional, and in everything, as a traditional American, as Orthodox, I'm traditional. And it's not to say everything's perfect and keep everything exactly as it is, but to say that I see these root values and these core beliefs and moral guidelines that are really good and useful, that I want to keep preserving and hanging on and passing on. That's my idea of, what it is to be traditional.
Yeah.
And so being that way, I kind of look at it and I go, like, when I grew up, you didn't want to be fragile, weak, vulnerable. These were not things you held up as, goals, as types that you want to emulate. You wanted to be strong and tough and resilient, and I think that there are reasons, not just for the sake of being strong, tough, and resilient, but there are reasons you want to be that. And it's going to ultimately produce a better life for you. Whereas now, with everybody clamoring to be the victim, to be offended, what kind of life is that going to produce for you?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be miserable.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. You have anything you want to plug or promote? Book, podcast?
I got a book coming out, but I'm not sure. Probably another month or two. Whatever.
By the time some people hear it, he'll have a book out. So be on the alert. I'm sure you'll go.
Yeah, if you're interested in orthodoxy, and you come especially from a Protestant background, or see, I kind of had these subgroups, and you have somebody you're writing to when you're writing.
Okay.
So my first group was kind of Protestant inquirers into orthodoxy who have opened themselves to the possibility. So I'm kind of juxtaposing and playing things to show, that some of the differences and why I believe Orthodox is a reflection of the apostolic teaching. But then there's another subcategory of the Copts who grew up as cradle Copts and may not appreciate what's in front of them, because it's, like if you grew up in a household and you think mom is always on my case, wants to know everything, always in my business, she's so oppressive. But then you take an orphan who's been living on the streets for 5 years, without food and begging, and you move him into the house, he's going to see mom a little differently than you are. And he's going to go, oh my God, she feeds you, she clothes you, she takes care of you, she mends your wounds. And yeah, she's nosy and in your business stuff because she really loves you and she knows what can go wrong. And so you have a kind of a different insight. And so I'm hoping that for cradle Copts, this will offer some insight to what this looks like from the outside to somebody coming in, and help them maybe to appreciate things that they may not fully appreciate because they've just kind of always been around it.
Nice. Well, I look forward to reading it. And, thanks for stopping by. Hope it's been a benefit. You schooled me. So we'll have to have you back for some other fascinating conversation, God willing.
That was really nice, and just hanging out with you again, even if it's virtually. We haven't hung out in way too long.
It's been a while. It's going to be a while. So until I see you again.